Sorry, I forgot to start this recording earlier. So far, we've talked about conical reserves, which were kind of an older model, possibly still used by some hang gliders, but I'm not totally sure. They open fast and they only have lines attached to the bottom of the reserve. They're still open on top to allow for airflow coming through. And that airflow causes a little bit of lift along the top of the reserve, which helps slow you down. Next, we talked about pull-down apex chutes here. The key difference here is that unlike our conical, these have lines attached to the opening on top, and so that gives it a lower profile, and it actually allows for airflow to follow kind of the top shape of the reserve a little bit better due to the Coanda effect, and so that allows you to have a stronger lift force. That lift force slows you down does a better job of slowing you down, as well as keeps you stable from your kind of pendulum swinging under the reserve. So it should help slow down that swinging. Cool. So moving forward, didn't want that to happen, but that's there now. So these pull down apexes, they had like one minor improvement fairly early on in their design. Let's see, something like that, where they put on what's called a double cap, which was basically this extra little section of material along the top. If you ever see people parasailing on the big round parachutes behind a boat, you'll see a lot of these kind of double cap structures. And the main idea with that is that it really guides that airflow and turns it along the outer surface of the reserve. Still has the same lines as above. And so that actually generates a bit more of a lift force, and it kind of gives a second little Coanda effect thing above that as well. So it just increases lift, helps slow it down a little bit more. Just due to the ability to direct that airflow. Call that a double cap. So all good and fine, but still that 6.8, 6.2 meters per second sink rate is pretty quick. I would not feel comfortable coming down on something quite that fast. Probably save your life, but probably break a leg. So pushing the development on these reserves a little bit farther, we got the annular pull down apex, PDA. And the main thing that did is instead of just having this opening stop on top, it actually brought the material down into the wing. So the outside of the wing would still look kind of like a big circle, but then this opening is actually pushed down toward the center. That's where you now have all your lines coming out. And so it kind of looks like a oblong donut sort of shape. Now these are being made, they were shifting kind of the material so they're actually going to be lighter with an even thinner profile. Now the big thing that this does is as air is leaving here, it's immediately starting on this radius. So it starts really curving and rotating to follow the top surface of the wing, generating more lift, which you're seeing as a slower descent rate. So more lift on these guys, which goes to a slower descent. I don't actually have a number written down for those descent rates, but I believe they're on the order of 5 to 6 meters per second, just depending. When you're buying a reserve online, you should be able to find stats on the actual listed descent rate at its given weight range. So that's the annular PDA. That's probably what your GIN, the 1G, G1, I can't remember what that one's called. Most of your round reserves are probably going to be an annular PDA. If you're unsure, you can always look it up online. Or if you're doing your own repack, if you can see that the material on the apex is pulled down closer to kind of the opening of the reserve, then it is a annular pull down apex. I believe these are what's currently being manufactured for the rounds overall. Then we look at how do we improve this farther, and we saw that companies started making square or cross, some people call them cross-shaped reserves. A little bit harder to draw, so give me a second here. What do we have going? Something like this. And then that. We've got our little square reserve there, all sorts of lines coming down, as well as some lines from kind of the inside here. Just refolded one of these today, so got a nice fun reminder of how weird the line structure is on the inside of these. Now these are even a thinner profile than what we've seen so far. So this is going to be the thinnest. I don't know. It's really thin. And a bit wider usually than what we've seen so far. And that's nice because that means that we're using a little bit less material actually on these. We can save some weight. But the big bonus on these is actually that these vents are out here on the corners and they allow airflow to come out and kind of curve away from each corner. Now what that does is it helps keep you from spinning. The reason for that is there's in mechanical engineering it's called the moment of inertia, and it's essentially the likelihood of something to start to rotate. And so an example of that is that if you had like a triangular plate, it would be harder to toss that like a frisbee than it would a disc of the same size. And so what these vents do is they actually kind of block this rotation. So it's less likely that this reserve is going to get into a rotating, spinning situation. The other big thing, which of course is the real bread and butter, is the descent rate on these, which we're looking at 4.6 to about 5.5 meters per second descent rate in most cases. What's this say to you? Yeah, so in this case, we can usually see a lighter reserve that actually slows you down even more. So they tend to cost a bit more, but usually well worth that price if you're looking at not only saving life, but also saving a limb. So I'm recommending that most people go with the square, as was recommended to me. This is probably the most common of what's recently being purchased and manufactured. There's still plenty of these annular PDA out there as well, which do a fine job, so I'm told. But moving forward, more recently, you've probably heard a lot about these steerable reserves, also known as Rogallo. They're called Rogallo reserves because the guy who actually really started making things happen with paragliding actually started on this type of a design. And if you see one in the air, they're kind of heart-shaped, would be how I describe them. Now, I don't know exactly how steerable these things are. I've heard mixed stories. Some people say you can move a good bit. Some people say you can decide which way you're facing on landing. So I think it kind of is just going to depend on conditions. I don't think they have a very high horizontal speed or anything. So if you're in wind, I don't think it'll cut through much of that for you. And then with that, I believe they tend to go in the direction that they're pointing. I'm not totally positive on that. But what I can tell you on these guys, they have about a 3.8 to 4.8 meter per second sink rate. So definitely the lowest sink rate we've got. The downside with these though, and I'm sure many of us have heard that you have to disable your canopy every time you throw. That's not necessarily true, and I'll be explaining why in a bit here. But on a steerable, if you were to throw and now you're under your steerable reserve here, your canopy might be somewhere out here. Try that again. Kind of falling down this way. And as it does that, as we know from the aerodynamics talk, it generates lift out in this direction. And so it's not going to be possible to steer this thing if you've got your wing floating out to the side somewhere, steering you in another direction. And that can also cause issues just with how this steerable reserve is loaded if this thing's pulling you one way. Or that might not be as big of an issue if you're on something that can take a center load and can roll a little bit better than the steerable reserves. So you definitely must disable your wing. Actually, more than just disabling, you must pull your wing in. Pull in wing. And so that doesn't just mean pulling a B-stall or something like that you may have heard on some reserves. This means getting material into your lap because you don't want your wing generating lift to combat with this regalo. Now these are definitely more expensive, and I would say less common amongst our casual pilots or even most of our XC pilots. A really big thing though is that they're, so I'm told, nice for acro pilots. A big reason for that is that the wings on the acro wings tend to have shorter lines. Not lines. And that makes it easier to pull that wing in as the pilot now under the reserve. And the other thing is acro pilots are probably throwing way more reserves than the rest of us because they're practicing their moves over a lake. As you may know, if you're practicing a maneuver, that's when you're most likely to find your wing in a precarious position. Let's talk a little bit more about numbers on these different things. If we move back up to, let's say, our PDA, our pull down apex, inlet pull down apex. When you're thinking about making purchasing decisions, there's a lot of things to think about. So if you're going to want to prioritize weight, we've mentioned that these are definitely the lighter reserves, are going to be the squares. And then kind of between the Regalo and the annular PDA, kind of depends on the reserve itself. And you can also get these in lightweight versions. They might have a slightly faster descent rate, but you could be saving a whole lot on your weight if you're doing a lot of hike and fly. Looking for further, we have to repack these reserves at least once a year. Some people say 6 months, also great. For this talk, I'll say at least once a year. The big reason for that is when these reserves are all packed up, they're in these bundles. So we've got our container for our reserve. Let's say it is a box. But all the lines are coming out into these figure 8 shapes. So these are actually how your lines are kind of lined up inside your reserve container. And on each of these, we have a rubber band holding these little bundles of lines together, and then those are then packed into the reserve container, and you usually only see this little leash on the end sticking out. And so one of the main reasons to repack your reserve annually is that these rubber bands can degrade, right? If you've ever seen a rubber band kind of, let's say, holding a bundle of pens together in a drawer or something, after a few years, that rubber band turns into more of a plasticky, gummy or plasticky kind of substance or material, and then they won't break off of your lines as easily. And the whole idea when you throw that reserve out is that when it gets to tension, all these rubber bands either break or pop off of these bundles of lines. And so if you were to throw and that didn't break, you'd be having to pull that reserve back in and trying to throw harder. It just turns into a really dangerous scenario. So that's more than anything the crucial reason to repack annually. Also, if your reserve is getting a little bit of higher temperatures, That can lead to some problems with the creasing going on in the wing. Probably not a total problem most of the time, but it's not really worth the risk to find out, right? So repacking has to happen. Right now, a lot of us are going to send our reserves in either to Superfly or Cloud9, let's say, down in Utah. But a lot of us, like myself, repack every year on your own. So what does repacking look like for these things? Well, on our annular pull down apex, our double cap apex, all of these up on top here, we're looking at a repack, which is going to take about 16 steps. And by steps, we're talking about like flaking out the cells in the reserve, bundling, checking all the lines, doing your S folds and then your zigzag fold to get it back into your container. Takes about 16 steps. On your square reserve, they are a little bit more complicated. You have some kind of funny shaped cells due to these corners. And so the repack on those tends to take 22 steps. Which I've definitely noticed. I've been repacking the pull down apexes and the squares, and the squares do take more time for sure. I've definitely been noticing that, and they're kind of bundled a little bit weird because of so much material being kind of higher up within the reserve. If you repack yourself, you might know what I'm talking about there. But that's kind of the takeaway on those two. What's even more fun though is when we get into these regalos. I haven't had the unfortunate pleasure of repacking one myself, but I'm told that on these guys we're looking at 138 steps for that repack. So if I see myself getting a regalo at any point in the future, I will likely be sending it out once a year to get repacked. So that's a big consideration when you're making wing purchases. And definitely check in with your local instructor if you're buying a reserve anytime soon as to what they recommend, because it's really kind of location dependent. It's probably a lot easier for the Salt Lake guys to give their reserve to one of these schools that's doing repacks every day. And the nice thing about that is you've got somebody who's got their skills kind of sharp on the repack. And so you don't have to worry because you have somebody very skilled repacking it for you. Up here in Montana, it's kind of depends who you know. I definitely repack for a lot of my friends, and John and I are hoping to start doing some repacks up here for the local community. But for right now, I've been definitely telling my students that you'll likely be repacking your own wing and your own reserve, and so it's worth taking these things into consideration. And finally, putting the money where the mouth is, so to speak, how much do these all cost? Where's my cost on these guys? Here we go. So for our pull down apex, I'm gonna write this up here. Bear with me. The cost is gonna range probably in the $600 to $900 range. These are just very rough numbers. You can definitely find things cheaper, and you can definitely spend as much as you'd like to in paragliding, as many of us know. So 600 to 900, let's say, for those. For our square reserves, you're probably looking anywhere from 850, let's say 1300. I believe, I don't remember if it was Jin or Icaro, but somebody's got a square out that's even cheaper there. There's definitely new stuff coming out, and prices are coming down a little bit, which is great to see. Finally, on our Regalo wings, those you're looking at the higher price point, 1300 to 1650. You're definitely paying for the ability to steer and the kind of peace of mind that if you throw, you'll be able to have more control of where you land, and you'll land at a lower descent rate. Yeah. You guys have any questions so far on these different types of reserves? Up next, I'm going to be talking about kind of when to throw and what to do as you throw.
Hey Ryan, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So you get a reserve and you just hook it up, or do you suggest packing it at first to know about it, or a new reserve, let's say? Is
If
it
you're
good to
buying a
go
new
from the,
reserve,
yeah, is it
yeah.
good to go from
So
the manufacturer usually?
yeah, definitely check with who you're buying it from, right? Because a lot of schools are gonna have reserves in stock, and if those have sat on the shelf for a year, they're gonna need to repack. But most of any like responsible school that is selling you a reserve will be repacking everything annually. So with that, yeah, you should be set that like once you buy the reserve, you should be able to throw it in your kit and be ready to go fly. But try to find out when that date was that they last repacked it. If you can't find out and you don't know, the safer bet is to get it repacked before you put it in your kit and plan on using it. So great question. If you get it used, I would say tread with caution. I've seen everything I've seen that's been on the used market. They list when their last repack was. You will with how much you can trust somebody you don't know with that. Yeah.
Ryan, you hear me?
Yep.
I'm wondering about pendulum stability. You know, you read about the stability that different canopy or different parachutes have. Can you touch on that a little bit? Do you have any info on that?
Yeah. So I'm not totally sure on the regalas what the pendulum stability is like. My understanding is that you can do a little bit of weight shift on them, and if that's the case, then they definitely respond to how you fall underneath the reserve. But on your squares and your annular PDA, um, these are going to be fairly stable. That was a big thing with this annular pull down apex, where they actually brought this material down into the reserve. That allowed for even more kind of your net lift coming out this way. What that does for you is if you're kind of shifted out here, you're now loading this one side that wants to generate more lift more. And so what that turns into is it brings you down to a stable position underneath, vertically underneath the reserve a bit faster, and should hold you there fairly well. The squares do this as well. I mean, they're letting air escape out the sides, and I talked a little bit about that, how that helps resist spin. They're also letting air come up over the top. And I believe some of them do have an opening here that does even more air coming out over the top. That's kind of all for the same purpose. It's going to generate more lift for the reserve, and it's going to try to keep everything oriented so that you aren't swinging out side to side like this. I actually don't know numbers between the square and the annular PDA for which is going to be more stable as a pendulum. I do know that these earlier reserves, like your pull down apex or your conical reserves, are definitely less stable pendulum wise. So it's worth getting something modern, definitely.
Okay, thanks. You know, I just was looking at the manual for my reserve. It talks a lot about the stability and sink rate, and they say stability is as important or maybe more important than sink rate. Obviously, if you're swinging when you land, you're going to get hurt, just like if we make a hard turn when we're low. Just curious
Right,
about
that's the
that.
big thing. Because if you're way over here with this reserve parachute way over here, I mean, you're looking at an almost free fall situation as you swing back underneath it. So that's when you're going to have the highest speed, and that's why that pendulum stability is very important. Um, I think it's at this point, there's been a lot of development into that pendulum stability. I think it'd be hard to, as a consumer, to find enough data to really back which reserve is going to be the most stable in that pendulum situation. But if any of you have seen good information on that, please feel free to let me know so I can include it in my future classes.
Ryan,
Yeah.
what reserve do you have, and what are the pros and cons of it?
Yeah, so I've got so I have got the Independence Ultracross, and I am like preaching for this reserve. It's weighs less than a kilogram, so I believe it's the lightest reserve on the market right now, and its sink rate is something like 4.5 or 4.8. I want to say, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's definitely a really low sink rate, and it's the lightest reserve that I've been able to find in the market. And Independence makes really, really good reserves. Definitely would be my recommendation if you're just looking for blindly which company to go with. I know at Fly Life we've also been selling quite a few of the Icaro Square and Icaro Lights. Still great reserves, really low sink rates, but it's tough to beat the weight on this one. I believe it's 0.98 kilograms, which is pretty nice. Yeah, it weighs about as much as one of my shoes, I think, or something. So
Nice.
For comparison, how heavy are other reserves?
well, that's a good question. Numbers I should probably have pulled up. Off the top of my head, the Evo Cross, which is in Independence, makes a similar reserve to that one, but it's not the lightweight version. It's still one of the lighter reserves on the market, and it's about 1.5 kilograms. Let me pull up some numbers really quick for you if I can. I'm not going to be able to get to it in a timely manner right now.
No worries, but it sounds like it's on the order of like half a kilogram to a kilogram.
Yeah, I think a lot of reserves are probably closer to that 2 kilogram mark. But having not actually brushed up on what's on the market right now recently, not positive. I do believe that these Regalos are a bit heavier though, so I've been told. Yeah. Cool. So let's start talking about when we should throw. Plenty of good reasons that I'm about to get into. Something one of the guys from the Utah Facebook group posted that is always true is when in doubt, throw it out. Now, unfortunately, when you throw, that's going to end your flight. You won't be able to pull that reserve back in, stuff it somewhere, and then continue flying if things restabilize. So a lot of hesitation comes in, like, should I throw? I'm not sure. When do I need to throw? That sort of thing. And a lot of pilots will try to fix their wing if there's a situation going on for quite a while before throwing. But a few things to consider is that for the reserve to fully open and be fully effective, you need to be, depending on the reserve, probably 300 to 800 feet above the ground. So if you really want to be sure that it's going to help save your life, if you're in this range, if there's any doubt, you should be throwing for sure. Below this, I believe I was talking to, I believe it was Chris Sanacroce recently, and he made the point of like, even if you're under 300 feet, who cares? Throw. It's more material out in the air causing more drag, which is going to slow you down more. Now, whether or not your reserve is totally open, tough to say for sure, but if that reserve's out there and in the air, it should be slowing you down. And that's your big goal. So even if you're under 300 feet, you should still be throwing. But plenty of things to consider if you're above 800 feet, above 1,000 feet, and we'll get into that. So when to throw. Some really key times is that your wing is not flying. Now, what I mean by that is you have sustained massive deflations, massive collapses, and you're at a point where the wing is not opening back up above your head like it normally would. This can be from anything from just a major cravat to tangles in your lines to a line breaking, all sorts of things, whatever might be causing your wing not to fly how it should. The other big thing is going to be rotations getting out of control. Many of you probably know if you're really deep in a spiral, you can start to get lightheaded and can cause you to pass out. And if you're in the spiral, we call it kind of getting locked into it. It can be hard to get out of that spiral. So if you're starting to get dizzy, like really starting to get dizzy, and you don't feel like you're coming out of your spin, out of your rotation, it's a good time to throw. This is the number one reason for deployment. Number one reason. Because you don't want to be dangling under a paraglider passed out without your reserve thrown. You'd much rather be dangling under a paraglider passed out with your reserve thrown, or even better, not passed out at all. These rotations, it's these, as you're rotating around your wing in this circle, and your wing's somewhere out here, you know, the pilot kind of sideways whipping around it. The big issue is you're building up G-forces because you're feeling like you're getting pushed down into the center of your harness as you're rotating out super fast around this wing. And so the G-force that you build up can lead to your body not being able to get enough blood and enough oxygen to your brain, and that's what causes you to pass out. So G-force to pass out, not good. So those are a couple of the main reasons to throw. Outside of that, tough to think of anything. If your wing's not flying over your head, or if you're rotating out of control, yeah, that's going to be when you're going to throw. If anyone can think of anything major right now, feel free to chime in. But sorry about that. Got my first little bit of cardio exercise out in like a month, and now it sounds like I'm fully COVID, but I don't believe that's the case right now. So we'll move on. Yeah, what's up?
I wanted to pipe in for a minute because I know we're talking about a lot of scary stuff, and there's some new pilots here online, and I just wanted to pipe in and just say that, you know, I've been flying for 5 years now, and, you know, well over 200 hours, and I've never thrown my reserve. And, you know, there's times when we throw them when things go bad, like you said, but this is not a common thing that happens all the time. I just wanted to, you know, let the newer pilots know that. But we still study for that, because studies show that when we prepare for these situations, we make better decisions in the heat of the moment. So that's kind of one reason we prepare for it, but it's the kind of thing that we hope it never happens unless we want to throw our reserve.
Definitely. That's a really good point. This kind of stuff does sound scary. Man, I've been in the air and had some pretty major collapses, pretty major deflations, some kind of scary rotations, and I've never reached for my handle either. So I think it does kind of, I would say that most pilots I've talked to have never had to throw a reserve. However, if you do have to throw it, it's like, that's the right thing to do. You won't be shamed for throwing a reserve. People will be upset if you didn't throw a reserve when you should have. They won't be able to be upset at you because you didn't throw that reserve. So I know I was talking to some friends at Superfly, and they're saying that they're now just teaching like everyone's going to throw a reserve eventually. So getting that mindset, that way you don't have any like negative connotation about throwing. But to John's point, I would say it's not super common that people have to throw. So this is, yeah, material for to prepare you for the worst. We'll just say that. Cool. So a couple of good reasons to throw. But important thing is once you throw, you no longer are a pilot. You are now a passenger. You're going to go where that reserve goes, and it's going to take you where the wind takes you. And the reason I say where the wind takes you is this is where we do have to kind of start considering where are we at in the sky, right? So what's our altitude, in other words? When I got my instructor cert, the other guy doing it with me, his name's Vito, he was telling me the story of a guy who he was like thermaling up doing this big cross-country flight in Southern California, way out over the desert, I believe. And I want to say he was like 8,000 feet above the ground or something. He was way up there. maybe higher even. But he had some pretty big collapses happen and threw his reserve. And I believe it was something like 15 miles that the wind carried him into the desert. And not being prepared for that, he didn't have enough water or food. He made it back. He was fine, wasn't hurt, but definitely, I'm sure, would have been happier to not have thrown from that high up. So just keep in mind that if you're this pilot under this reserve parachute now, if you're really high up, if you've got a wind going this way, you're just going to drift along with it as you descend. So you might end up way farther away than you expect. So that's an important thing with what's your altitude. It's also an important thing to always, no matter what, always know what's downwind. That's your situational awareness. So when I did an SIV with Andy McRae, he was telling me about, like, keep in mind this box that you're that's always with the wind and coming from you. And this box is like kind of a likely landing zone that you might be in if you had to throw that reserve. The important thing to, the reason this is important is if there are power lines or something in that box, that's going to be a problem, right? We don't want to end up draped over a power line. If there is a big cliff right there, if there is anything on the ground that seems like it'd be a bad situation, right? So with that in mind, throwing your reserve in an SIV is a great idea because you'll kind of get a feeling for that descent rate and hopefully for your drift and some light wind. The main idea is that you want to avoid flying in air that could end up putting you into some nasty stuff on the ground if you're coming down on a reserve. So just a couple of things to keep in mind there as far as throwing. I mentioned the altitude thing a couple times. There are a lot of like deflations, collapses, whatever you want to call them, that you can get reopened up in the air, whether that's adding some brake input, some A input. Sometimes it's doing nothing and just allowing your weight to refill that wing, get it opened back up. If you know how to, pulling a full stall, a lot of people call that the reset button on your wing. As long as you can get out of that full stall safely, practice that in an SIV with an instructor on radio. But the reason those things are all important is if you're really, really high up in the air, like at cloud base or above, you really want to be able to give your wing time to reinflate if possible. Now, unfortunately, if you're stuck in a rotating spiral and you're starting to get dizzy, there's not a whole lot you can do in that situation, so you might just have to be the passenger and go where it takes you. But if possible, if that wing is deflated, try to get it open back up before throwing until you're kind of down around the, 2,000 feet above the ground. That's when we're really starting to look at, okay, how high am I? Do I need to throw? What's the deciding factor? That sort of thing. You guys have any questions on kind of when to throw? I'm going to move into, once you've made that decision, what your sequence of events looks like. All right. Sequence of events. I mentioned this already, but the start is going to be, you've decided you're going to throw. You've made a deliberate, intentional decision. That's not how you spell that, but we'll move on. I'm an engineer, so I think it's allowed that I can't spell. Decision to throw. What does that mean? That means you're no longer still unsure. You're no longer thinking, maybe I'll grab that handle. It's like, no, you've decided you're going to throw. So from here on out, you will not change course of action. What we're going to do is first we're going to look at the reserve handle if you can. Next time you're in your harness in a simulator or if you're on a nice easy flight, try to look at your reserve handle. I always try to look at my reserve in the air just so I know exactly where it is. Usually a little bit after launch when I'm flying stable, I'll reach out in front and grab my reserve handle. I've got a front mount, just so I can always remember, okay, that's where my reserve handle is. It's right there. And then I continue on with my flight. So your first step here is going to be to look at your reserve and to grab that handle. Or I think, man, I don't remember who it was who told me this, but they said, rather than look and throw, know and throw. And that's that deliberate intention to constantly be looking at that reserve to know where it is on all your flights, rather than just when you need it. If you know where it is, you'll grab it faster. Maybe you'll grab it as you're looking at it, something like that. Anyway, you've now grabbed your reserve handle. You're going to want to pull that reserve up. Depending on how it's situated in your harness, you may have to pull it out if it's a side-mounted reserve, or kind of sideways and out if it's a front-mounted reserve. But once you get that reserve out, you're going to pull it up and look at it. So pull up, see it, and then when you throw, no matter how you're oriented, you're going to throw down past your seat board. This will allow you to not have to keep track of kind of your orientation in the air. If you're kind of sideways or upside down, just always throw past your seat board. The idea there is that the wing is usually not going to end up under your feet for any reason as you're in the air. You'd have to be in some pretty wild kind of rotating points between your risers. I mean, even if you're deep in a rotation, deep in a spiral, your wing's still above your head. You just might be sideways. So throw past your seat board. 4, sorry about that. 4 is we're going to watch that reserve come out. As we watch it, what's going to happen is the lines are all going to stretch out. Lines are going to stretch. There we go. Rubber bands and container are going to pop off. I mentioned the rubber bands earlier. You probably won't see those pop off in the air, but you will see that container pop off at the end. That's going to be after your reserve's totally stretched out. The way that we orient the lines in the container itself will keep the container around the reserve until the lines are totally stretched, and then they'll pop off. And then the chute will get some drag, get over your head, and start to open. Okay, so those are the things that we're looking for in that order. If any of those things don't happen, first thing you have to do is, we'll put a little star here. Maybe we'll write it in blue to indicate this is if things go wrong. First thing you're going to want to do is grab your bridle that's still connected to the reserve and yank the hell out of it. To start, a really hard, aggressive tug on that bridle might be enough to pop those last couple of rubber bands that aren't coming off for some reason and allow that reserve to open up. If it's not, your next step is going to be to pull the reserve all the way back in and rethrow. The only reason that I've heard of people having to do this is that their first throw, they kind of pansied it out. They just kind of let go of it. They dropped it. If you have decided to throw, you're now deliberately and intentionally throwing. That means grabbing that thing and hitting somebody on the ground with it, no matter how far away the ground is. You really want to put some effort into that throw and just make sure that it's an aggressive and intentional throw. So now, hopefully, you've got that reserve opened up. Things went right. So we're going to get ready to PLF. PLF is going to be your parachute landing fall. That doesn't sound right in my mind. John, tell me if that's wrong. But the idea there is that you're coming down, your reserve is hopefully hooked up to your shoulders. In some cases, they're still going to be hooked up to your main carabiner. But as you're descending, you want those feet out. You want to be in kind of an upright position. And then as you come down, our idea is that we're going to hit with our feet at a bit of a these are our feet. We're going to land at a bit of a 45-degree angle, so we can roll all of that energy down kind of along the side of the body, over the back, hopefully absorbing a lot of that impact with the padding in your harness, and then rolling across your back on that fall. That's something to practice with like a step ladder or something out in the backyard in your harness. Just practice that PLF so that you're ready for it if you need it. So here, you probably noticed I didn't include the step that a lot of people will include, which is to disable the wing. And that's because you shouldn't always be disabling your wing, and this is why. The reason that we've all been taught this is that you have a reserve parachute. So rely on the reserve parachute, cut your wing, make sure nothing bad happens, your wing doesn't get tangled up in it, whatever. But if we've now thrown our little reserve, we're the pilot down here, that's going to be our pilot. More than likely, your wing has somehow kind of shaped that wing shape back up, and it's probably falling out in front of you. Now, what we've learned earlier, a week or so ago, about aerodynamics, is that we have all this lift force happening out here on the wing. And so what that means is you have this resultant force pulling this way. And a big takeaway on this is this: if something's pulling you in one direction constantly, that's going to help stop you from spinning. That's going to keep this thing from rotating around this way and keep you from starting to spin and get dizzy from that spinning. The other thing, unlikely that you'd reasonably be able to steer much on your still inflated canopy out here, but this lift force is pulling you in a horizontal direction. So from a technical aerodynamics perspective, you could steer slightly like this. Now, the times that this is dangerous is if the swing starts to get low and underneath you, because now that lift force could still be happening and pulling you down a little bit faster. Or if that wing is getting pushed up into your reserve here, that can cause your reserve to start to deflate. It's going to mean that your wing itself isn't inflated, and it can get tangled in your lines, things you definitely don't want. Those are situations where absolutely you're going to try to get that wing out of that situation by what we call disabling it. Now, usually what that disabling means could be as simple as a B stall. We're going to reach out, grab your B lines, and pull them as hard as you possibly can. The issue with talking about this in this way, though, is right after you throw your reserve, you have this moment where your wing is completely unloaded, because now all your weight went onto the reserve, and the wing has to fall to catch some air before it reinflates. During that time period, that's when it's going to take the least effort to pull that B stall or to pull lines in to completely disable the wing. And so if you happen to know that you have to disable your wing, that would be the time to do it. Unfortunately, if you're in an SIV, if you're not as familiar, let's say, with your wing, you might not really know what's going to happen until that wing reinflates. And so now if the wing's kind of out here or down here, it's much harder to pull the B stall because the wing's inflated and it's below you. So you're now having to try to pull it up or pull it sideways into you versus being able to put all your weight on it and pull it down like you normally would flying. So there is definitely some trade-offs with talking about not disabling like this that I just want to make clear. So best case scenario is you're going to be in an SIV with 2 reserves, throw your main reserve, see how your wing responds, try to disable it if you have to. If you don't, let it keep flying. If things go terribly wrong, you have a second reserve. Off that second reserve, you'd definitely be able to disable your main chute, although you'd be moving so slow you probably wouldn't need to. Again, that's a best case scenario thing. I'm not saying that that's going to be reasonable for everybody to be able to have a second reserve and try to do that. But that's how you would know the response, right? So conveniently, when Gabe was telling me about this, the main takeaway he told me was, unlike what is commonly being taught, is he said, do not disable your main wing unless you should. So that gets to be nice and confusing. The main thing to consider here, though, is that if things are stable in the air, don't change anything. So if the wing is maybe a big crumpled ball up here that you're still attached to, as long as it's not getting in the way of your reserve or getting tangled or causing any problems, leave it. If the wing's out in front of you and just sideways and it doesn't seem to be causing an issue, it's not turning and whipping you around for any reason, if it's just sitting out there stable, leave it. Because disabling the wing is going to decrease the amount of drag that you get off of it. And so that's kind of the main takeaway to consider on this. You guys have any questions on the sequence of events? I know this last part is kind of not what's commonly taught, so probably raising a lot of red flags for people right now. Feel free to do some digging on research on why they're telling you to disable that wing. But I mean, if things are stable, more drag is good. We want to slow down as much as possible. So that's kind of what I'm trying to preach here.
Ryan, you always read about downplaning, and if you're so high, you have time to assess where you're at and so forth. And but the question is, for somebody who hasn't ridden down on a reserve more than a couple of times, how do you know really where you're at in terms of downplaning or pulling that in? And are we better off to say, you know what, let's pull in the wing all the time? That's the question that goes through my head after hearing what you discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm actually should probably brush up a little bit, but my understanding of downplaning is that's more of this situation where the wing's kind of pulling you down. And then there's the talk about drift in the wind, so you have to kind of know where you're at. But I mean, the main thing, if you've got, maybe a good way to think about this is if this wing is out here and suddenly starts causing problems for you, it is going to take some upper body strength for sure to disable that wing. So if you're like a relatively strong guy like yourself, Scott, shouldn't be a problem to pull that in with the reserve out here, at least pull in a B stall. Although if you're concerned about that, yeah, disabling the wing, I mean, then the wing won't get in the way of your reserve. That's a very fair point. But it means that you're sacrificing by probably increasing your descent rate a little bit because you don't have your main wing helping to slow you down. There's definitely some trade-offs there. And I don't have the perfect answer. I'm preaching this talk because this is what Jeb has been telling me. He's telling people not to throw those reserves, and he's thrown so many that I'm just going to trust that. But yeah, I would definitely agree that this is kind of a tough balance here, is do you disable or do you not disable? But I've heard from a lot of experienced pilots now that if the wing's stable and the reserve's stable, don't change anything. That's maybe one takeaway. Yeah.
I'll agree with that, Ryan. If the wing's stable, leave it as it is. But every situation could be different. Just be prepared. Earlier, that's one reason we study and kind of mentally prepare for all situations. So if we ever find ourselves there, we're able to make better decisions, faster decisions, faster, better decisions.
Yeah, that's right. Cool. That's all I've got for you right now on these reserve parachutes.
I had one more tip, Ryan.
What's that?
One more tip. Every time you pack your reserve, it's a good time to practice your PLF while the reserve's out of your harness.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, if you're like me, my reserve's a little over $1,000, so it's not something I like to just jump and smash on.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, that's
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I've got a question. In my little brief history, I initially started out with a Malian connecting my reserve to my harness, and then switched when I went down to Utah under the advice of somebody well respected to go to the large spur. Do you have any? Does the group have any consensus on what's best, or is it really up to harness manufacturer?
The question between the Malion or the girth hitch between the reserve and the harness? Yeah. So the issue on the Malion, the number one issue, is that little vibrations can cause that Malion to get loose and to unscrew. Or every time it's in your wing, if it's moving around, rubbing around. So if you're going to use a Malion, definitely use pliers and crank that thing down. I know what Andy McRae does for his students is he'll actually throw duct tape behind the screw itself just to add a little bit of something to see if that'll help. That thing does come unscrewed. It's come unscrewed for a lot of people. A lot of people have pulled out to repack and just seen that it's suddenly open. And so that's the big scare there. Some people argue it's one more thing to fail. It's another way of looking at that. But the downside on the girth hitch is it's possibly causing more wear on the connection point, where the two pieces of fabric are hitched together. Because as you throw, that thing gets really tight all of a sudden. That's going to cause a lot of friction, for sure. I'm not a big fan of that argument unless you're somebody who's going to have to throw a reserve a lot. So probably an acro pilot. So I'm usually telling people to do the girth hitch. It can be a little bit more of a pain if you're trying to swap reserves out between harnesses, but I think it's generally the right call. Because yeah, there aren't really that friction that you'll build up between the two pieces of material is not going to be enough to break that off of one throw. It might be off of like thousands of throws. And so that's where I don't really see a downside on the girth hitch personally.
Okay, thank you.